Hello, everyone. It's Professor Buzzkill, busting myths, taking names. And one of the things we like to do on the show, as I've said so many times, is not just bust myths and take names, but talk about sort of the unknown people in history or the people who should be better known. And one of them is a man named Malcolm W. Browne, who is a news photographer. And he took perhaps one of the most famous pictures of the 20th century and one of the most famous pictures of world history. And very fortunately for you, we have a veteran buzzkiller on the line, a veteran guest on the show, and that, of course, is Ray Boomhower from the Indiana Historical Society and many other organizations, who's written several books about very, very important 20th century people. And I'm so grateful that he comes on the show because his books are absolutely gripping and completely worth buying and reading and passing on to friends. So, Ray, thanks so much for being here.
Professor, glad to be back, always.
This book is about the famous picture of the self-immolation of a Buddhist monk in Vietnam. A picture I think almost everybody has seen and known. But really it's a biography of the photographer. And the photographer himself, his life and career is so fascinating. First, before we start, what drew you to Malcolm Browne, the photographer we're talking about?
My interest in Browne, who's really wasn't trained as a photographer, but was a reporter. That's what makes the story so interesting. The fact that here's a guy who was a reporter, but happened to have cameras at the right moment and always had cameras with him whenever he went out on assignment, just so he could be ready for something as important as what happened in Saigon on June 11th, 1963. But Browne's one of those guys who was always self-sufficient, ready for any kind of action, and someone who, when he was in the field, tried to get the story and get it back to the office. He wrote this great 24-page field guide for coverage in the Vietnam War that he shared with other reporters, particularly with the Associated Press, his colleague Peter Arnett, who called it one of the great documents that he ever read. And he said if the Army had produced it, it would be classified. It had so much great detail. But one of the things he emphasized, you can't tell the story if you're dead, your main goal is to go out and bring back the story and the photos. And he always made sure to do that.
Well, it's like so many of the people you write about, he does stunning, stunning work, but the work becomes more famous than him. I mean, in some senses, that's a good thing because, after all, we don't want everyone to have inflated egos. But
Right.
In some senses, I can imagine, the Malcolm Browne's descendants, are out there saying, damn it, my great-grandfather needs more attention.
Well, I will admit that I had not heard of Malcolm Browne himself. I, of course, had seen the photo. It's one of the iconic images of the Vietnam War and in history. But I came across his name through my last book, which was a biography of World War II correspondent named Richard Tregaskis. I'm always very comfortable in the world of journalism. That's how I got my start. I was a newspaper reporter here in Indiana for a couple small town newspapers. And so I enjoy investigating that world and those who, went to far away distant lands and made sure to get the story back to the folks at home. And Tregaskis, near the end of his life, had gone to Vietnam in the early 1960s to produce another book. He's, of course, famous for Guadalcanal Diary, but he produced a book called Vietnam Diary and was there talking to American advisors and ARVN soldiers in South Vietnam. And he had a run-in with a young reporter named David Halberstam of the New York Times.
I think people may have heard of him, yeah.
Might have heard of him, best-selling author. Tregaskis to Halberstam, he was a hero to him. And so he made sure to go out one day and introduce him to his sources throughout the Mekong Delta region. And as they were going back that night, Tregaskis said to him, if I was doing what you were doing, I'd be ashamed of myself. So it wasn't quite exactly the interaction that Halberstam wanted with his hero. And so when Tregaskis came back to the United States and Halberstam produced a book called Quagmire, it was about his experiences in Vietnam. And Tregaskis wrote a very scathing review of the book. And at the end, he mentions that there was another book by another gentleman named Malcolm Browne of the Associated Press that was a much more nuanced and balanced look at what was going on in Vietnam. So that hit me directly. And then, of course, later I learned that he's not only a consummate reporter, but also took one of the most famous photographs in journalism history.
Let's just quickly remind the listeners that the Associated Press, along with United Press International, was one of two, at least the most important American news services back in the day, way before cable news and 24-hour news and all that sort of stuff. And so AP and UPI reporters were absolutely vital in the chain of information coming back to the United States and to other places in the world, of course.
They had bureaus all over the world, including Saigon, and there was a very pitched competition between Browne of the Associated Press and Neil Sheehan, who was working for the UPI in Saigon.
Yes, another famous author who had written about Vietnam extensively. Well, let's not keep everyone hanging. Please tell us about this horrible incident.
There was a Buddhist religious uprising in South Vietnam in the spring of 1963. It grew out of the belief by Buddhists in the country that their rights were being trampled by the government of President Diem, which was very Catholic. They had come out of the North and when 1950s and settled in the South, trying to get away, of course, from the communists in North Vietnam. Had established positions in the government, and one of the understandings, although Diem always denied this, was that to rise in government, you had to be Catholic. Well, the Buddhists were upset by this. There was a demonstration in Hue. They weren't allowed to fly their religious flags. There was gunfire from local police. People were killed. And this sparked an uprising throughout the country with demonstrations by Buddhist monks. And they always threatened to do something quite dramatic to try to kickstart their demands for rights. And Browne, who had followed the demonstrations and talked to the monks, drank tea with them, went to their pagodas and wrote extensively about their religious beliefs and their demands, was ready. He thought that they would do something quite dramatic. But a lot of the other newsmen in Saigon, the Western newsmen, thought it was kind of like the boy who cried wolf. They threatened to do something really dramatic and had not followed through on that. So on the evening of June 10th, Browne received a call from a source of his, from one of the Buddhist monks, who told him, Mr. Browne, I advise you to come to this demonstration tomorrow. Something dramatic is going to happen. And so he took them at their word and was there and made sure to have a camera with him. He was one of the few newsmen there and the only one with a camera. So when the monks got up out of the pagoda and started marching down the street in columns, following a small Austin automobile, which was a different sight. Browne had never seen an automobile in one of the Buddhist demonstrations before, so he knew something was different. After a while, the automobile stopped in this major intersection in Saigon. The monks kind of circled around the car. Two younger monks helped an aged member of their order, Thích Quảng Đức, as we've said before, helped him to the center of the intersection, put a small pillow on the ground for him. He sat in a lotus position. And these young monks poured this pink liquid over Quảng Đức. And Browne realized with horror that something truly terrible was going to happen. And the monk sat there calmly, lit a match, and killed himself for the Buddhist cause. And Browne took a series of pictures of the immolation leading up to it and afterward as well. And he said he really only could handle such a terrible sight because he was concentrating on the mechanics of actually taking the photos, what f-stop use, what kind of shutter speed and all that. He said later, but he couldn't keep out the smell that he smelled from the burning flesh of the monk.
Yes, it is absolutely an horrific picture, and it's one of these things that, I have to warn my students about ahead of time before showing them in class, although I do show it to them in class, even though there are some complaints about, being triggered and things like that. But I do show it to them, insist on showing it to them, despite what the administrators say, because a lot of world history, especially a lot of 20th century history, is absolutely horrific. Mm-hmm. And so it's important for people to know that. So this is sort of the culmination of Browne's career, at least his sort of major, famous photograph. But as so often with your books, as so often with the research, as so often with your work, you show not only the background of the incident is fascinating, but the history and the career of the person involved is fascinating. Someone might write this off and say, oh, this is just the guy happened to be there and he happened to have a camera with him, blah, blah, blah. Well, that's not true at all. He has a long career career of choosing or wisely strategizing, figuring out where to be in certain journalistic situations, and as you said, being prepared. So I'm going on far too long. Please tell us the background about Malcolm Browne and his marvelously productive career.
It's a great career, particularly when you consider that he didn't think of himself as a journalist. He thought of himself more as an accidental journalist because his initial training had been as a scientist, a chemist. He'd worked for 5 years as a laboratory chemist in New York City. And it was only when he was drafted and sent overseas to South Korea, this is at the end of the Korean War, the armistice had been signed, but he still had to fulfill his duty for the army. He was trained as a tanker, but he goes overseas and finds this public information office, this American base, and there's an opening there. And they said, well, you'll have more fun with us than tooling around the countryside in a tank. So he decided to join them instead, and that's where he first started to work as a journalist. Fell in love with Asia, really wanted to return there, but had to go home and found a job on a small newspaper in New York, the Middletown Record. And once again, as I experienced when I got my first job out of college as a reporter, you're expected to do just about everything on these small town staffs because there's just not enough manpower there to do everything. So you have to go out, report a story, take photographs, come back, develop the film, print them up, even lay out the paper from time to time. And so Browne really got great training when he worked on the Middletown paper, and also got a taste for the life of a foreign correspondent because they sent him to Cuba. This is at the Cuban Revolution had broken out. Castro had overthrown the government of Batista, and so there's this new rebel government in power. And Browne goes to Cuba to report on what's happening there and what's going to happen with the island nation. They're going to turn communist. They're going to be democracy, and decides that he wants to keep on it as a foreign correspondent. So he gets on the staff at the Associated Press, starts out in Baltimore, but they send him to Vietnam to head the bureau for the AP in Saigon. And he arrives there in November 1961, really not dressed for the climate. He's in a wool suit and a top coat in the 96-degree heat, but immediately he's entranced with the country and has one of the great bureaus, I think, in history. It's himself, a guy named Peter Arnett, where a lot of people will remember that name from the Gulf War, and a photographer named Horst Faust. And all of them would go on to win the Pulitzer Prize for their work from Vietnam. Browne, as bureau chief, made it his practice that reporters should carry cameras into the field because they could take images, and even if they're not greatest image, Faust could probably do his magic and turn them into something that they could send out over the wires. And Faust, who was a great and interesting guy, was always out in the field. That's where he loved to be. He would gather all this great information, come back, and Arnett and Browne would help him turn the information into a publishable story that they could send out over the wires. So they did a little bit of everything in this small bureau in Saigon. And Browne would go on to cover the coup in 1964. Diem, of course, is killed in that coup. And his reporting on that, he was able to get Pulitzer Prize for international reporting, sharing it with David Halberstam. I always see sometimes, this is something that cropped up when I was doing my research for the Browne book, that people think he won the Pulitzer Prize for photography for that image of the burning monk. However, he was beaten out, if you can say that, by a photographer for a Dallas newspaper who was there when Jack Ruby came into the Dallas police station and shot Lee Harvey Oswald. And that's the photo that won the Pulitzer Prize that year.
Yes, who wins the Pulitzer Prize for reporting. And by the way, while we're on this subject and while we're using that term, I'm always fascinated by the fact that reporting and reporter sound very old-fashioned now because everyone has wanted to be a journalist ever since Watergate and Woodward and Bernstein. But everybody of Browne's generation and even of Walter Cronkite's, generation, which I suppose is the same generation, but you know what I mean. And Walter Cronkite's fame talked about themselves as reporters. Now, I know journaliste is a French term, and that's where we get journalist, but I've often found that distinction interesting, and I wish it were used more often. I wish we had a lot more reporters, maybe fewer people who think they're great analysts calling themselves journalists when they're just reporters.
Yeah, Browne was someone, because of his training as a chemist, was used to making observations and putting them together into facts. And that's something he did with his reporting. He would go out into the field, glean all this information from troops, from villagers, and come back and send it out over the wires. And there was always this clash at that time in the early 1960s during America's early involvement in the Vietnamese Civil War, that the Kennedy administration did not want to have our involvement splashed over the front pages of newspapers. They wanted to keep it quiet. Browne called it kind of a gray war. Our government, especially the South Vietnamese government, really wanted the newsmen, the Western newsmen in Saigon, to kind of get on the team, support the cause. And as they went out into the field, they saw that perhaps this, wasn't working as well as they thought it was. They had, tried to tell that story in the reports they sent back home to the United States.
So he's covering lots of stuff in Vietnam and in Saigon. Tell us some more about some of the other things he covers up to the other things he covers and reports on, I should say, up to the self-immolation.
Well, the South Vietnamese government was quite upset with some of the reports, of course, from the Western newsmen in Saigon. So as the Buddhist demonstrations continued after Thích Quảng Đức self-immolation, the secret police kind of tried to intimidate the Western newsmen. And there was a demonstration that they covered, and these newsmen attacked Peter Arnett. And there's this famous photo that Browne shinning up a telephone pole to get this photograph. His fellow AP newsman Arnett is being attacked, but David Halverson kind of barrels through the crowd and protects Arnett from these attacks. They also tried to intimidate Browne at his home, which was an apartment over the AP office on Rue Pasteur, and two policemen armed with pistols show up knocking at his door. Well, in his travels throughout the country, in his time with mercenaries and Green Berets, Browne had picked up an old German machine gun, and he kind of used it for self-protection at home. So he carried that gun with him as he answered the door, and immediately the South Vietnamese saw this gun and realized they were outmatched, and so they away into the night. But of course, the major story that happened after the Buddhist protest was the coup that overthrew the government of President Diem. Browne was there with Arnett and Faust covering the pitched battles that were happening right down the street from their office. In fact, there's a photo of a tank burning outside the AP office as a result of the fighting that was going on for the coup.
So clearly he's at the center of action in Saigon, and he's paying attention to all these things going on. So it's not unusual that he gets that phone call from someone who tells him that something important is going to happen. Walk us through maybe not a minute by minute, but certainly a half hour by half hour run through of what happens, how he finds out about the protest coming up, and how he gets there, all that sort of stuff. And for instance, that little vignette you tell, and it's also in the book, about him seeing them in a little Renault car and never seeing that at a Buddhist protest before, and that sort of setting his antennae going. That's a fascinating detail. So more of those, please.
Well, of course, Browne gets the tip-off from his source, one of the Buddhist monks, telling him that, Mr. Browne, I strongly advise you to come. I expect something very important will happen, but I cannot tell you what. And he delivered a similar message to all the resident correspondents in Saigon, advising them to be in a small pagoda. And his counsel was ignored by most. But as a wire service reporter, of course, Browne was always afraid of being scooped and didn't want to be beaten by his competitors on what could be a major news story. And also, this monk's previous tips to him had all been good. So he decides that the Buddhists were perfectly serious about doing something pretty violent. And in another civilization, it might have taken the form of a bomb or something like that. And he realized that any ghastly human sacrifice by the Buddhists would be futile unless the Western press, which at the time was the only only free press in the country, carried what was going on to the outside world, because the South Vietnamese press was controlled by the government. So he sets out early in the morning on June 11th. He's accompanied by his AP colleague, Bill Van Tran, and they arrived at the pagoda. They were directed to about 7:50 a.m., and services were going to start at 8 o'clock, and the Buddhists were known always for being extremely punctual. And the monks had set up some chairs inside the pagoda for the newsmen. And Browne looked around and realized that he and Tran had the only cameras among the newsmen who were gathered there. At about 9 o'clock, the chanting stopped, and approximately 350 monks and nuns, as if they'd practiced this maneuver beforehand, began to file out of the pagoda. They lined up in the alleyway and proceeded onto the street, walking down it arranged in 3 or 4 rows. And some of the marchers unfurled banners with slogans printed both in Vietnamese and English that beseech President Diem to honor the Buddhist demands. A gray Austin sedan with about 3 or 4 monks inside led the march, which was an innovation for such demonstrations. He said that it seemed strange to me that at the time the monks were now riding instead of walking. And when the procession stopped, the monks who'd been in the Austin got out. One of them opened the car's hood and pulled out a 5-gallon gasoline can made of translucent plastic. And it filled it with what appeared to Browne to be a pink liquid. Two of the younger monks accompanied the older monk, Thích Quảng Đức, and resting his hands on their arms, and he went over to the center of the circle in the intersection. Sweat started to break out on Browne's brow as he got his camera ready, anticipating that a horror show was at hand. That's what he called it. A monk placed a small brown cushion on the pavement. Quảng Đức positioned himself on it, crossing his legs in the traditional lotus position. And Browne, from his location, which is about 20 feet to the right and a little in front of Quảng Đức, who kept his head slightly bowed, watched as the monks assisting the elder monk emptied all but 1 liter of the liquid over the old man, soaking his face, body, robes, and cushion. At 9:22 a.m., Browne could see Quảng Đức hands move a bit in his lap as he struck a match. When he lit the match, Tran appeared at Browne's elbow, and recalling the incident later, Browne said that in a flash, the monk was sitting in the center of a column of flame, which engulfed his entire body. A wail of horror rose from the monks and nuns, many of whom prostrated themselves in the direction of the flames. Browne found himself numb with shock at what he was witnessing, calling it a kind of a horror, and he almost automatically, shot several rolls of 35 millimeter black and white Tri-X film. The only thing that keeps you going in war or in times of crisis like that is having something to do, he said. Trying to keep his mind off what he was seeing, Browne kept thinking the sun is bright and the subject is self-illuminated, so F16 at 125th of a second should be right, but I couldn't close out the smell.
By the way, let's remind the listeners that this is the day, this is back in the day when you had to set all these things on your camera manually. So F16 is the size of the aperture of the lens, this speed of the shutter and all that stuff. All that matters tremendously. And so having to make these sort of calculations on the fly because it's sunny and because now there's fire is very important.
Eventually some fire trucks arrived, but the monks threw themselves in front of the trucks, in front of their front and rear wheels so that they could have advanced it by rolling over the monks, which they did not do. Browne immediately thought to himself, what do I need to do next? Because he had to get the photos out of the country as soon as he could. And it was a difficult thing to do in Saigon on short notice because of censorship. So what mattered was to get the raw film that he had shot, shipped by air freight or some other way to the closest transmission point, which happened to be AP's bureau in Manila in the Philippines.
Okay, now this is interesting to me because obviously it's so different now. We can upload anything almost anywhere. But of course, you're saying that he has to while all this is going on, and when he's back processing the film, he has to think, okay, now I have to think about censorship. I think, how do I get it to a transmission point where then presumably is sent by wire to the AP distribution service? This is just fascinating. I hate to say this because you and I are both we were at least alive during this event. This sounds very oldie worldy.
Very much so. And the fact that they had to find what they call a pigeon, which was a passenger on a regular commercial flight who would be willing to be cajoled to take this film with them to Manila. And they did this several times with news stories or photographs that they wanted to smuggle out of the country. And so they managed to get someone to do that. And so Manila had the facility descended via radio circuit to San Francisco, and from there to the news agency's headquarters in New York. And it took about 15 hours, 9,000 miles journey over the AP's wire photo system before it was able to appear in newspapers all across the country. And it was quite dramatic. The one that most newspapers used was a tightly cropped image showing Quảng Đức engulfed in flames with the Austin and a small number of monks in attendance in the background. And later, his full sequence of photographs from the self-immolation, including an expanded view of Quảng Đức sacrifice, described by AP editors as the ultimate protest available for publication. And although it appeared on a lot of front pages across the country, it competed for space with a stand at the classroom door made by George Wallace in Alabama, trying to keep Black students out of the University of Alabama. So it competed for space with them. And some places wouldn't run the photo. The New York Times, which thought it was too much for their readers, so instead they used the image that Browne took of the monks placing their bodies in front of the wheels of the fire truck instead.
Well, Ray, there's this famous story, and I don't know if it's true. You would know if it's true. That Kennedy's reaction when he saw the picture, when he walked in the office in the morning or whatever it was, is quite, illuminating.
This is.
Tell us that story.
He was on the phone with his brother, Robert Kennedy, the Attorney General, probably talking, of course, about the events going on in Alabama. And Kennedy's gaze went down to the newspapers that were on the desk of his in his Oval Office, and immediately saw that photo that Browne took, and cried out, "Jesus Christ!" He couldn't believe what he was seeing on the front pages of newspapers all over the country, and realized it was something that was going to be quite dramatic. And when he called Henry Cabot Lodge later to the White House to discuss him becoming the new U.S. ambassador to South Vietnam, the president had on his desk that Browne's monk photograph. And Lodge later said, "I suppose that no news picture in recent history had generated as much emotion around the world as that one had."
And it's amazing to me that Kennedy didn't get that picture somehow sooner than seeing it on the newspaper. That some AP person in Washington, before it even was printed, didn't run over to the White House and say, "Give this to the president right away, Mrs. Lincoln," who was his secretary.
Right.
But that's what would happen now.
Yeah.
So we got it through the normal, if you will, journalistic flow of information.
Well, and Kennedy, of course, was, an inveterate newspaper reader. So he's going to see all these. He had a lot of papers delivered to his office. So that's what struck him when he first saw it.
I just continually struck, as you've been mentioning throughout the interview, all the other things that are going on in 1963. What a year to have been born in my case. But, it's just amazing. It's not as if Kennedy is on the phone with some other cabinet official talking about a relatively minor thing when he sees the picture. He's on the phone with the Attorney General about an extremely crucial domestic problem, and this international thing hits him. What was the reaction in other parts of the world?
Quite dramatic, and a variety of groups use that image for their own means. There was a group of clergymen in the United States that used the photograph for full-page ads in both the New York Times and Washington Post that protested American military aid to a country that denied most of its citizens religious freedoms. Of course, Vietnamese Buddhists emblazoned the image on placards that they carried during demonstrations in South Vietnam. And officials in communist China, seeing this as a great propaganda tool, used the image for propaganda purposes. They distributed copies throughout Southeast Asia and attributed the monk's death to the U.S. imperialist aggressors and their Ziemist lackeys. And President Diem himself questioned, I think it was the U.S. ambassador at the time, Frederick Knowlton, or some other American officials, did the newsman, pay the monk to do this? Or was he somehow drugged? Of course, Browne said it was nonsense. They didn't pay the monk to do this. And from what he saw, the monk was perfectly sober in his right mind when he made the ultimate sacrifice for his cause.
Well, the story of the monk itself is fascinating, and there have been lots of things written about it. But we sort of left Malcolm Browne hanging there after the photo has been sent out. First of all, as you said, as he's taking the photograph, he's desperately trying to concentrate on the technical aspects so that he isn't overwhelmed with the emotion of it. How does he handle the emotion of it? Or do we know how he handles the emotion of what he had just seen after the photograph is gone and he doesn't have to worry about any sort of technical parts of it anymore?
Well, during his time in Saigon, he met and fell in love with a young South Vietnamese woman named Lee Lu, who had worked for the U.S. for the South Vietnamese Information Agency. And they eventually married, but she was living with him in his apartment over the AP office. And she remembered him coming in with tears in his eyes over what he had seen. And of course, immediately went to take a shower to try to get the smell off his body. It was just something that always haunted him. He said he doesn't think many journalists take pleasure from human suffering, but, sometimes they do profit from others' pain and they inadvertently influence events they cover. And although sometimes those effects are good, they can be tragic. Either way, when death is the outcome, psychic scars remain. And something I think that stayed with him throughout his life until he died in 2012 from Parkinson's disease. As a journalist, he kind of realized that one of the fringe benefits of seeing all he saw all over the world was accepting the ubiquity of death, he called it, permitting us to enter the heathen equivalent of a state of grace. And it was a gift, he said, not to be scorned. So, although it weighed on him, he kind of used it because he wasn't a very religious person himself, but used it to kind of handle what was going on in his life at the time.
Well, there's so much more in the book, dear listeners. It's just a riveting read. I know riveting and gripping are terms that I use over and over and over for the books that we talk about on this show, but it's true about them all. It's especially true about your books, Ray. But, to take a slightly lighter turn, is this the only book you've written about someone who's not from Indiana?
No, I did a couple of others as well. Robert Sherrod, they're war correspondents
Oh, yeah.
from Time magazine, of course, who covered the Marines as they swept through the Central Pacific. And then the last one, Richard Tregaskis. Browne also was from New York City, so had no connection to Indiana. And I really kind of looked at the Browne book as three stories in one. It's the story, of course, of Browne and his life as a reporter. And it's the story of course, that iconic photo, which, when you think of Vietnam, you think of the monk, you think of the young Vietnamese girl who's running down the road naked, accidental napalm bombing of her village. And of course, you have the Tet Offensive image of the South Vietnamese chief of the South Vietnamese National Police shooting the VC guerrilla in the head at point blank range. But it's also the story, the book, of Browne in Vietnam because he kept going back. He was there from 1961 to 66. He left the AP, worked for a time for ABC television, thought that television was going to be more important in getting information to the public than newspapers were. Eventually left ABC, didn't really have a good time with all the make-believe and worried more about makeup than getting a story for television. And worked for a time as a freelance journalist, writing about Vietnam for True Magazine, which is a men's magazine. Returned to the United States, became a foreign correspondent for the New York Times, and also wrote a science column for the Times. But kept going back to Vietnam. He was there in 72 for the Easter Offensive. North Vietnam's rolling into southern Vietnam, but they were stopped. And was there for the Times in 1975 for the fall of Saigon, whose anniversary here is coming up quite soon. And, was there trying to get as many people out of the country as he could, dependents of the Times and relatives of his wife, Li Lu, and was on the chopper, being escorted from Saigon to the fleet offshore. And, looking back, just spilled a lot of tears because that country and so much in his life.
Yes, well, as I say, it's just a riveting read. It's a fascinating story. It's a fascinating long life. It's often people, they win an award and then people forget about them, but this is not the case with Browne. And we don't want to give away the entire story because we want people to get the book. It's obviously on the Buzzkill bookshelf in the blog post for this episode. So it just remains for me to say thank you so much, Ray, for coming on the show again.
Professor, it's always a pleasure to talk to you.
Well, Buzzkillers, please go to the blog post. Please go to ProfessorBuzzkill.com. Do everything you need to do there. And we will talk to all of you next week.